At 1:55 in the morning, the seafloor 80 miles off the Oregon coast broke open, and 8 seconds later, it broke again, 30 miles away. Two separate ruptures, almost back-to-back, deep under the Pacific. Nobody on shore felt either one. No alarms went off. But if you live anywhere along the Pacific Northwest coast, this is the same fault system that keeps earthquake scientists checking their phones at 2 a.m. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Here's what we know so far. A magnitude 4.9 earthquake struck at 1:55 a.m. on August 6th, 2026. It hit about 128 kilometers, roughly 80 miles, west-southwest of Port Orford, Oregon. That puts it well out in open ocean, far past where any fishing boat would normally sit at that hour. The quake was shallow. It ruptured only about 8 kilometers or 5 miles beneath the seafloor. Shallow quakes send stronger shaking straight up, like a knock on a thin door instead of a thick one. Then, just 8 seconds later, a second quake hit. This one measured magnitude 4.1. It struck about 48 kilometers, 30 miles to the west, closer to Gold Beach, a small coastal town of about 2,300 people. No tsunami warning went out. No damage was reported. No injuries were reported. And that combination, a strong quake, a near-instant follow-up, and almost total silence on land, is exactly the kind of pattern that makes seismologists lean in closer, even when the public barely notices. If a magnitude 4.9 earthquake happened 80 miles from your coastline in the middle of the night, would you even want to know about it? Or would you rather sleep through something you couldn't have stopped anyway? Tell me your honest answer in the comments. And if you want to understand this fault system before it produces something bigger than a 4.9, hit subscribe. Because we're about to explain exactly why this one stayed quiet while a similar sounding quake 2 years ago sent 5 million people scrambling for high ground. It's just before 2 a.m. on Thursday, August 6th, 2026. Most of the Oregon coast is asleep. Port Orford, a small fishing town of about 200 people, sits quiet on its rocky bluff above the Pacific. 80 miles out from that bluff, past the edge of any map most residents would recognize, two pieces of the Earth's crust are pressed against each other under enormous strain. They have been grinding past one another slowly for years without moving cleanly. That's not unusual. Most of the time, rock doesn't slide smoothly. It catches, holds, and builds up pressure, the same way a heavy drawer sticks in its track until you yank it hard enough to jolt it free. At 1:55 a.m., it lets go. Energy that had been building for who knows how long releases in a matter of seconds. Seismic waves radiate outward through solid rock and through 8 kilometers of seafloor sediment above the rupture. Instruments on land, part of a network run by the U.S. Geological Survey, pick up the signal almost instantly. The reading comes back at magnitude 4.9. Respectable, but not massive. To put that in perspective, a magnitude 4.9 releases roughly 30 times less energy than a magnitude 6.0, and about 1,000 times less than a magnitude 7.0. It's the kind of quake that can rattle dishes if you're standing right on top of it, but 80 miles out at sea with 8 kilometers of rock and water in between, almost nobody on shore feels a thing. Here's where it gets interesting. 8 seconds after that first rupture, barely enough time to take 2 breaths, a second quake hits. This one is smaller, magnitude 4.1, and it's centered about 30 miles to the west of the first one, nearer to Gold Beach. 2 ruptures on 2 different patches of the fault, separated by less time than it takes to read the sentence out loud. Seismologists have a term for this, a triggered event. Think of it like a row of dominoes that aren't quite touching. You tip the first one, and it doesn't fall directly onto the second. But the vibration, the shockwave moving through the table, is enough to nudge the next domino over anyway. The first earthquake sends a pulse of stress through the surrounding rock. If a nearby patch of fault is already close to its breaking point, already sitting right at the edge of slipping, that pulse can be the final nudge it needs. It's not that the first quake caused the second one out of nothing. It's that the second patch was already primed, and the first quake's shockwave arrived at exactly the wrong moment to hold it back. This stretch of ocean floor isn't some random, unremarkable patch of seabed. It sits along what's known as the Blanco Fracture Zone, a long scar in the Earth's crust that runs roughly 350 kilometers, or about 220 miles, between 2 major tectonic boundaries off the Pacific Northwest coast. Unlike the famous subduction zone that everyone worries about, where one plate dives underneath another, the Blanco Fracture Zone is what's called a transform fault. 2 plates aren't colliding here. They're sliding sideways past each other, like 2 conveyor belts running in opposite directions, scraping against one another as they go. That distinction matters, and we'll come back to it, because it's the key to understanding why this particular night ended in silence instead of sirens. For now, picture the scene as monitoring stations. Along the coast, start logging the data. In Port Orford, in Gold Beach, in Bannon and Coos Bay farther up the coast, Residents are asleep, unaware that anything happened at all. There's no equivalent of a fire alarm for an earthquake this size, this far offshore. The U.S. Geological Survey's automated system detects the shaking, calculates the magnitude and location within minutes, and posts it publicly. But for an event like this, there's no reason to wake anyone up. No tsunami threat is identified. No structural risk exists for a town 80 miles away. The earthquake becomes, for most people, a small entry in a public database rather than a lived experience. But zoom out, and the picture changes. This event didn't happen in isolation. Oregon's coastline has been unusually active this year. In the 30 days before this quake, the largest recorded earthquake near Oregon was a magnitude 5.5, out past Langlois. In the year leading up to this event, the single largest quake off the Oregon coast reached magnitude 6.0. None of these were headline-grabbing disasters. All of them were part of the same ongoing, mostly invisible process, the Pacific Plate System grinding, releasing, resetting, and grinding again. That's the story of this quake on its own. 2 ruptures, 8 seconds apart, 30 miles apart, both modest by earthquake standards, both essentially unnoticed on land. If this were the whole story, it would be a minor entry in a long list of Pacific Northwest seismic events. But the reason this quake is worth 20 minutes of your time isn't what it did, it's what it didn't do, and what almost happened somewhere else less than 2 years earlier, under conditions that sound almost identical on paper. Now let's go back to December 5th, 2024. Same general stretch of coastline, same broad tectonic neighborhood. A completely different outcome. At 10:44 in the morning, broad daylight, not the middle of the night, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake ruptured off the coast of Northern California, near the town of Petrolia in Humboldt County. The quake was initially estimated at magnitude 6.6, then revised upward to 7.0 as more data came in. That's not a small correction. Each full point on the magnitude scale represents roughly 32 times more energy released. A jump from 6.6 to 7.0 meant the earthquake was significantly more powerful than first believed, closer to 3 times stronger than the initial estimate suggested. Within minutes, the National Weather Service's Tsunami Warning Center issued a tsunami warning covering the coast from Davenport, California, all the way north to the Oregon border, near Douglas and Lane counties. Roughly 5 million people came under that warning. In San Francisco, public transit shut down. The San Francisco Zoo evacuated its guests and secured its animals. Along the coast in Humboldt County, sheriff's deputies urged residents to move inland to higher ground immediately. About 10,000 homes and businesses in the area lost power. Highway traffic backed up as people tried to drive away from the coastline, unsure how much time they had. And then, about 90 minutes later, the warning was canceled. No damaging tsunami wave ever arrived. No deaths were reported. No serious injuries were reported. The earthquake had caused some real, if limited, damage. Cracked roads, spilled shelves in stores, a jolt strong enough to be felt as far away as the San Francisco Bay Area, more than 200 miles south. But the tsunami that so many people feared, the reason transit stopped and zoos evacuated and highways clogged, that never showed up. So here's the wait, why moment. Both of these earthquakes happened along the same rough stretch of the Pacific coastline. Both involved plate boundaries connected to the broader Cascadia system. One measured 4.9 and produced silence. The other measured 7.0 and produced evacuations for 5 million people. Even though, in the end, no tsunami actually struck either time, the difference isn't really about which quake was scarier. It's about geography, fault type, and how warning systems are built to react to uncertainty. The August 2026 quake sat on the Blanco Fracture Zone, a transforming fault where 2 plates slide horizontally past each other like a slow-motion collision between 2 trains running on parallel tracks in opposite directions. That kind of sideways motion doesn't push the seafloor sharply upward or drop it sharply downward, and a tsunami needs vertical motion. It needs the ocean floor to suddenly lurch up or down, like a trapdoor snapping open beneath a swimming pool, shoving the entire column of water above it into motion. Sideways sliding, even a lot of it, usually doesn't do that. The December 2024 quake near Petrolia sat almost directly on top of the Mendocino Triple Junction, the single point where 3 tectonic plates meet, the Pacific Plate, the North American Plate, and the Juan de Fuca Plate. That's an unusually complicated piece of geology, close enough to shore that the U.S. Geological Survey initially measured the quake's depth at roughly 10 kilometers, about 6 miles down, almost directly beneath the coastline, rather than far out at sea. A triple junction is exactly what it sounds like. A messy intersection where multiple faults meet, where rupture behavior is harder to predict in the first critical minutes, and where a large magnitude reading close to shore is treated as a worst-case scenario until proven otherwise. Here's the part that surprises most people. Tsunami warning systems are built to react fast, not to wait for certainty. When a large earthquake happens close to a populated coastline, the automatic warning threshold kicks in almost immediately based on magnitude and location alone, not on a confirmed analysis of exactly how the fault ruptured. That analysis, the kind that tells scientists whether the motion was mostly vertical or mostly horizontal, can take longer than the warning. The system is willing to wait. So the system erred on the side of caution. It warned first and confirmed later, which is exactly what a good warning system should do, even when the tsunami never comes. The one-line version a kid could repeat to a friend, it's not how big the earthquake was that decided the panic. It's whether the ground moved up and down or side to side, and how close it happened to where people live. To really understand why one quake stayed quiet and the other triggered evacuations, you need to understand the difference between the two kinds of faults sitting off the Pacific Northwest coast, because this region actually has both, stacked next to each other like two very different machines bolted to the same wall. The first kind is the transform fault, like the Blanco Fracture Zone where August's quake happened. Picture two long lines of people standing face to face, each line holding hands with the person across from them, then both lines starting to walk sideways in opposite directions. Hands slip, grip again, slip again, mostly staying level with each other the whole time. That's a transform fault. The Pacific Plate and the Juan de Fuca Plate are sliding past one another sideways, not climbing over or diving under each other. When they slip, the ground shakes, sometimes hard, but it mostly shakes sideways. The seafloor rarely lurches up or down enough to shove a wall of ocean water into motion. The second kind is the subduction zone, and it's the one that gets far more attention for good reason. Off the coast of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California sits the Cascadia Subduction Zone, a roughly 1,000-kilometer, 600-mile-long boundary where the Juan de Fuca Plate is being forced underneath the much larger North American Plate. This isn't two lines of people sliding past each other. This is one line of people slowly being pushed down and under a raised platform, while the platform above stays locked in place, bending and storing pressure, the way a diving board bends before someone jumps. For hundreds of years, that locked boundary can hold. Stress builds. The North American Plate, the one Oregon and Washington sit on, gets very slowly compressed and dragged downward at the edge. Then, when the lock finally breaks, the plate doesn't just slide. It springs back upward all at once like a diving board released after being held down for centuries instead of seconds. That sudden upward snap can shove a massive column of ocean water skyward in an instant. That's what generates a true tsunami-producing megathrust earthquake, the kind of event scientists refer to, half seriously, as Cascadia's Big One, a hypothetical magnitude 8.0 to 9.0 event that has happened before in this exact location, roughly every 300 to 500 years, based on geological evidence in coastal sediment layers and even in old Japanese tsunami records from the 1700s. Neither of the two earthquakes in this video, not the August 2026 quake off Port Orford and not the December 2024 quake near Petrolia, was that kind of megathrust event. Both were far smaller, and both were connected to the messier edges of the system rather than the locked megathrust itself. That's an important distinction, because it's easy to hear Cascadia and tsunami warning in the same sentence and assume the worst-case scenario is unfolding. It wasn't in either case. But both earthquakes are still meaningful pieces of the same puzzle. Every quake along the Blanco Fracture Zone, every aftershock near the Mendocino Triple Junction, gives scientists another data point about how stress is distributed and released across this entire boundary system. None of these smaller events single-handedly predicts when or whether the locked megathrust segment will finally let go. But taken together, over years and decades, they help researchers understand how connected, or how separate, these different fault segments really are. Here's the misread we need to shut down clearly. This earthquake does not mean the Cascadia Big One is imminent, and it does not mean scientists are quietly bracing for something enormous that they're not telling the public about. It's an easy leap to make. You hear magnitude 4.9, you hear Cascadia. You hear same region as a tsunami warning earthquake from 2024, and your brain wants to connect those dots into one escalating story, but the actual data doesn't support that. This was a transform fault event on the Blanco Fracture Zone, mechanically a different type of earthquake than a Cascadia megathrust rupture, occurring on a completely different structure than the one that would generate the region's worst case scenario. Two quakes, 8 seconds apart, both under magnitude 5, are consistent with the kind of routine seismic activity this stretch of ocean floor produces regularly. In just the past year, Oregon's coast recorded a magnitude 6.0 as its largest event. In the past 30 days alone, a magnitude 5.5 struck nearby. This region is active. Active is not the same as imminent.